So swim jigs may seem like one of the most basic lures, but there are so many variables that you can do with them that makes them one of the most versatile possible baits to throw. And you can pretty much throw them all year as well. What is the difference between a finesse swim jig, a northern style swim jig, and your typical heavy wire hook swim jig that you see down south? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. So when I was up in La Crosse fishing the Bassmaster Kayak series, I kind of got into the finesse style swim baits. They're real popular up there. Any store you go into, they're going to have tons of options, and it's honestly a little overwhelming because when you look at a finesse swim jig, and this is the Outcast Tackle, this is their finesse offering. You can see there, they have a lighter skirt. It's very trimmed. There's not a lot in there, but if you compare that to like this thicker, normal style, this is the Dirty Jigs swim jig, one of the best ever made. You can tell that it's got a lot more material to it, where these northern ones, like this one here, which is, I believe it's called a Kuri-ichi, which is Sakana Tackle. It's a northern brand. Real light skirt, real light wire hook. Really just, once they bite it, boom. You don't even have to set the hook super hard with these. And then this one here, this is the Crocodigator swim jig. Great swim jig too. It's kind of a middle ground. But with these middle ground ones, you can actually just trim this inner skirt and you get a finesse style swim jig. So everybody gets overwhelmed with the choices. I mean, there's so many out there. I mean, you even have ones like this, which this is a custom one. You can see that skirt is real light. And it's pretty common for a lot of anglers in the north to throw these style where there's not a big skirt on it. I mean, it is almost just like a jig head with a little bit of color and then a paddle tail or whatever you decide to put on it. Sometimes they put like craw. And a lot of these northern fishermen, they will use it in ways that a lot of us down here don't really do, which is dragging it on the bottom, imitating like a fleeing craw. A lot of them just slowly crank it, that really steady style thing where it just barely nips the top of the grass, like up there at La Crosse, a lot of eelgrass, you can just kind of bounce it over there. And that's what I had a lot of success doing, was chucking it under banks and just slowly cranking it with the finesse style. That leads us into, when do you throw these style of jigs? Being a kayak angler, I feel like a swim jig is like one of the best ways to cover water, because unlike a chatterbait, it's very finessey, but at the same time you can power fish it. So you can chuck it up under the trees, you can skip it, you can do whatever you want with it, you can let it sink to the bottom. That's really important for a kayak angler, because personally when I go out in my Crescent Shoalie, I don't like to take a lot of rods. Sure, I can get away with taking 8 to 12 rods if I really wanted to, but then you have all those rods sticking up behind you, when you could just take a couple rods and you're good to go. So when should you throw the normal style over these finesse styles? When it is a little bit higher pressure and you want to cover a lot of water, you're always going to see me throwing these smaller swim jigs. And what I like to throw those on is like an MBR style rod, like the NRX 843 or 844. Something that loads up really well. I usually like 14 to 15 pound fluorocarbon on something like that, because when those fish are a little bit more pressured and you need to cover water, I found that they'll still hit, even in like the dead of summer, they will still hit these finesse style swim jigs. Whereas if you're throwing like a full size swim jig, your normal standard heavy wire swim jig with braid, that's a big offering. I mean, they're gonna eat it. Don't get me wrong, big bass eat this all year long, but it is a much more intimidating meal. I mean, that's a full size swim stinko. This is the, I think it's a 3/8 ounce Dirty Jigs and bluegill. That is my normal swim jig on a braided thing. So you can throw that pretty much anywhere you want, but it's a lot more, a lot more than these small ones. So when you're throwing these small ones, like this one here that I've trimmed up, this is the same bait, the same paddle tail, cut smaller, trimmed up skirt, smaller wire hook, trimmed weed guard. You can crank this really slow and it's still a juicy meal, but it's a lot more subtle. You can work it in areas a lot slower because it's lighter. You can creep it. It doesn't sink to the bottom as fast. And that's why I personally tend to gravitate towards these lighter wire swim jigs. So it can be a little overwhelming when you look at it. Like I've got like 8 of them here on my lap, and it's just like, well, where do you even start? Do you throw a heavy one? Do you want a light one? I'm typically going to go like this. You should throw what you're comfortable with, but when it really boils down to when should you throw one over the other, it's going to be conditions. I don't really like throwing these small light ones like the Curies or even these custom ones like this I don't like throwing these lighter ones if you're in pure slop. If you're just gonna be around like heavy matted moss and stuff like that, you're better off just using braid and throwing these heavy wire ones. Because even if you do hook up, there's a good chance you might lose them. So there's a lot of variables that you need to consider. I mean, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, but personally, when like right now it's summertime, we've had like constant 100-degree days, the water is boiling. Typically, you're not going to think like, oh, swim jig, but I think in the right conditions, if you throw these Finesse swim jigs, you can cover a lot of water because you can throw these in ambush points and just work them so slowly, because this one is only 1/4 of an ounce. So that means as you're working it with that paddle tail on the back, well, let's use this one. This is the same jig, paddle tail. You can put a big beefy trailer on these Finesse ones, and it doesn't really ruin the profile too much. I mean, it's still got that bluegill pattern like that. It keeps it higher in the water because these, you know, it's gonna help it ride up when you have these beefier paddle tails on it. But you can use whatever style you want, but coming through the water, you can just creep this thing ever so slow. And a big bass, like in a wood pile or even like a bank cut, they're gonna see this coming by and it's like, oh, easy meal, don't have to fight it. I can eat it in one gulp. Whereas with this bigger, unassuming one on braid, they might look at that and be like, you know, I would eat that, but it's hot. I don't want to have to maybe miss it if it comes by and I miss it. That's a lot of wasted energy. Whereas with these smaller ones, even the big bass will see it and be like, yeah, that's a worthy meal. So that's kind of my theory on it. We could go on for hours on what size, what colors, how much skirt material you need. But personally, I really do enjoy the northern style swim baits with the thin skirt. You know, that right there is a trailer that I did really well at. Lacrosse Bassmaster Kayak Series, that's the Jackal Rhythm Wave. And I actually just trimmed it a little bit. So I took off maybe like the first 1/4 of an inch. And that gives it that nice beefy look on the actual swim bait part so that it swims through the water steady. But it's a lot more of a compact package. So let me know what you guys think though. I'm curious what your favorite style swim bait is. I mean, we could go on for hours. I've even got some 1/4 or 1.25 ounce swim baits over there for like punching and stuff like that. So you can make them as big or as subtle as you want, but I think that's kind of the beauty of them. And being a kayak angler who likes to fish pretty aggressive, I like to cover water, I like to burn banks. I find the swim jig fits that style perfectly. Far as rods, like I said, I like a rod that loads up. You need a little bit of backbone, but one thing I will say though is I had a buddy who was using this medium over here with these Finesse swim jigs, and he was having no problem pinning those fish because these hooks are pretty light on these. So you can pretty much get away with any rod you want. You can use a standard jig rod. I would be careful though, because with these lighter wire hooks, you can very easily ruin a hook set. If you set it too hard, you could rip it out of its mouth. I mean, you could potentially bend the hook if you're not using the right gear, because these are not like your stout, dirty jig hooks like this one. You can see it's a heavy gauge hook compared to this one. So just be smart about it. I think a lot of rods work, truthfully. I think probably overthink it a lot when it comes to swim jigs, but personally I like a little bit of a rod that loads up really well. I've had a lot of success with that. So let me know what you guys think. Are you a northern style swim jig? Are you a classic power heavy muck style fishing swim jig?